welcome back to the channel. This week on Beyond the Gates, Fairmont Crest becomes the stage for one of the most shocking moments of the season. What begins as a celebration of love turns into a nightmare of betrayal, as Martin faces a surprise proposal from Smitty and an even greater reckoning from the past he tried to bury. The walls of the Dupree estate echo with secrets, manipulation, and the weight of choices made years ago. When the police crash the moment that was supposed to mark a new beginning, everything shatters. Was Smitty's proposal a symbol of forgiveness, or a cruel trap disguised as love? And who really called the police? Anita, Nicole, Ted, or the man standing right beside him? Tonight, we dive into the chaos that threatens to destroy the Dupree legacy forever. Fairmont Crest was no longer the tranquil haven it once pretended to be. Beneath the glowing chandeliers and soft murmurs of polite laughter, tension rippled through the air like electricity before a storm. The moment Smitty knelt before Martin, holding out a ring that gleamed in the afternoon light, time seemed to stop. What should have been a declaration of love felt instead like a trial, a test wrapped in the illusion of forgiveness. Smitty's smile carried warmth on the surface, but behind it lurked something unreadable, a mixture of love, fear, and quiet revenge. Martin stood frozen, his pulse trembling under the weight of the moment, as the ghosts of the past 2 years returned to claw at him once again. His confession to the police, a desperate attempt at redemption, had not freed him. It had only reopened wounds and awakened old predators who thrived on weakness. What he thought was an act of honesty had become the first domino in a chain reaction that no one could stop. Among the crowd, Anita watched with cold detachment. To her, Martin's confession was not bravery, it was betrayal. She had spent years protecting the family name, the Dupree legacy, the polished facade that shielded their world from ruin. And now, because of Martin's guilt-ridden conscience, everything hung by a thread. A single word from him could bring their carefully curated empire crashing down. For Anita, Martin's sin was not in what he had done 2 years ago, but in daring to expose it now, when the price of truth could destroy them all. Nicole, standing a few steps away, felt something different, a kind of pity tangled with curiosity. She had once believed in Martin's goodness, had once thought redemption was possible. But now, his so-called honesty felt strategic, like a calculated move to win back trust. And trust, in Fairmont Crest, was the rarest currency of all. Ted, silent and observant, knew that this moment was bigger than a love story. He understood that Martin's confession had stirred forces that had been sleeping too long. There were files buried deep, names erased, evidence hidden. Martin's decision to come clean risked unearthing it all. Ted had once defended him, had once believed that guilt made men better, but now he saw only danger. The police would not stop at Martin. They would dig deeper, through the Duprees, through the Armstrongs, through every secret that kept their privileged world afloat. And somewhere in that web lay Ted's own sins, too. He clenched his jaw as he watched Smitty's trembling hands hold the ring, wondering if love was ever enough to shield anyone from the consequences of truth. Martin, for his part, mistook the silence around him for forgiveness. He saw Smitty's eyes soften and believed it was love returning. But it was not. It was hesitation, a conflict between the heart and the mind. Smitty wanted to believe him, but the doubt had taken root. Was Martin truly ready to rebuild, or was this another mask, another performance? As Martin reached for the ring, he saw Anita's gaze slice through him like glass. Nicole's expression remained still, unreadable. He began to realize he was surrounded not by family, but by witnesses. Every gesture, every breath, every word he had spoken since his confession was being measured, weighed, and catalogued. The footsteps came first, steady, deliberate, wrong. The echo of boots against marble shattered the illusion of safety. When the police entered the hall, everything stopped. The laughter, the music, even the air seemed to hold its breath. Martin turned, confusion flickering across his face before fear took hold. He didn't need to see the warrant, he knew why they were there. Someone had used his truth against him. The sincerity he believed would heal had only exposed his throat to the blade. Smitty's face went pale. The ring still glimmered in his hand, but his arm fell limp, as if he finally understood the price of hope. The children stood frozen, eyes wide and uncertain, as the world they knew began to tilt. Martin tried to speak, but no sound came. His thoughts screamed instead, who had betrayed him this time? Was it Anita, who would sacrifice anyone for the family's survival? Nicole, who masked envy behind compassion? Ted, who had too much to lose if the truth resurfaced? Or was it Smitty himself, the man who claimed to love him but might have called the police to test whether that love could survive exposure? The questions spiraled faster than the room around him. He wanted to run, but guilt anchored him to the floor. He had asked for forgiveness and received judgment instead. Outside, Fairmont Crest glittered under the fading sun, its manicured gardens and pristine gates gleaming like a lie made flesh. Inside, the truth rotted quietly. The Dupree name had always stood for prestige, but now it would stand for scandal. The police moved closer. Martin could feel their shadows stretching toward him, swallowing him whole. In that instant, he realized there would be no escaping the past, because the past had never left. It had been waiting, patient and smiling, wearing the face of the people he loved. Smitty's breath caught as Martin was led away. He wanted to intervene, to say something, but the words curdled in his throat. Love had demanded too much already. What was left was survival. Perhaps he had done this, perhaps he had made the call. Or perhaps he had simply allowed it to happen, too tired to fight for a man who refused to let go of his ghosts. Either way, his silence sealed Martin's fate. Anita exhaled quietly, as if relieved that the problem had solved itself. Nicole turned her face away, hiding the flicker of guilt that threatened to betray her calm. Ted watched the scene unfold with the detached awareness of a man who knew that his turn might come next. When the door closed behind Martin, the noise returned, soft murmurs, shuffling feet, the clinking of glasses as though nothing had happened. But the spell had broken. Beneath the surface, fear began to spread. If the police reopened that old case, how many of them would fall? How many would be dragged down with him? And in the privacy of their own minds, each of them asked the same silent question: was Martin's confession the spark that would burn them all? Outside, the police car's siren faded into the distance, swallowed by the night. Fairmont Crest stood still, its lights glowing like embers over a battlefield. In his seat, Martin stared through the window, the reflection of his own face fragmented by the glass. He thought of Smitty's trembling hands, of the children's confused eyes, of Anita's cold satisfaction. He thought of what truth had cost him and what it might cost them next. No one in Fairmont Crest slept that night. Each of them carried a different burden: fear, guilt, rage, or relief. Yet none of them were innocent. Martin's arrest was not the end of a story, but the beginning of an unraveling. And somewhere deep inside, he still wondered if honesty was truly salvation. Or merely the fire that would consume them all. When dawn finally came, the estate lay silent beneath the morning haze, waiting for the next storm that would surely come, because in Fairmont Crest, peace was just another lie waiting to be broken. The aftermath of the proposal left Fairmont Crest in ruins, not in the physical sense, but in spirit. The once pristine estate, with its manicured lawns and immaculate facades, now felt like a prison of whispers and suspicion. The echo of Martin's arrest hung in the corridors like a curse that no one dared to name. For the first time in years, the Dupree family found itself under the same roof, not as a symbol of unity, but as a fractured empire desperately trying to hide its own decay. The evening that should have marked reconciliation had become the night that exposed the rot beneath the gold. Smitty sat alone in the same room where he had once dropped to his knees, staring at the empty space where Martin had stood. The ring was still in his pocket, cold and heavy, its promise tainted. He had convinced himself that he could forgive, that love could heal what time and guilt had broken, but the sight of those officers stepping into the room had ripped away that illusion. Somewhere deep down, a voice whispered that maybe he had wanted it to end this way. Maybe part of him had needed to see Martin punished to prove that the pain he carried was justified. But the silence afterward was unbearable. Love and justice had collided, and neither had survived the impact. Anita, meanwhile, began her quiet campaign to contain the damage. Every phone call she made was measured, every word carefully chosen to rewrite the narrative before it reached the press. She had spent too many years constructing the Dupree legacy to let one man's confession bring it down. To her, Martin was a liability that had been neutralized. But the tremor in her hands betrayed a deeper fear that his arrest might reopen wounds far older than 2 years. There were deals made, documents hidden, and names that could not afford to be spoken aloud. The moment Martin had confessed, those ghosts had begun to stir, and Anita knew that she was running out of time to bury them again. Still, she played her part to perfection, the grieving matriarch holding her family together, even as she maneuvered them like pieces on a chessboard. Nicole drifted through the days that followed like a shadow, unable to silence the gnawing guilt that crept into her every thought. She had known something like this would happen. She had sensed that Martin's confession would attract the wrong kind of attention, but she hadn't stopped him. Maybe she hadn't wanted to. The part of her that once loved him was now entangled with envy, resentment, and a strange, twisted satisfaction at seeing the man who had once rejected her brought to his knees. But guilt has a way of echoing louder than victory. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Martin's face, not defiant, not broken, but quietly resigned, as if he had known all along this was his fate. And though she told herself that she had no hand in his downfall, she couldn't shake the feeling that silence had made her complicit. Ted tried to remain the voice of reason, but reason had no place in the chaos that followed. He watched as Anita tightened her grip on the family, as Smitty withdrew into himself, and as Nicole drifted closer to the edge. He had lived through enough scandals to know when a storm was only just beginning. The police investigation would not end with Martin. The moment he had reopened that case, the scent of blood had entered the air, and now the wolves were circling. Reporters began to call, old enemies began to whisper, and the Dupree family name, once untouchable, became a question mark in every conversation. Ted saw what Anita was doing. She was preparing to sacrifice anyone necessary to keep her reputation intact. And he feared that before this was over, someone else would have to fall. At night, when the house finally grew quiet, Smitty could still hear the faint hum of police radios in his mind. He could still see the confusion in Martin's eyes as the handcuffs clicked shut. That image haunted him more than he cared to admit. He had thought he could live with the consequences of the truth, but now he wasn't sure. The truth had become a weapon, one that no one could control. What if Martin hadn't been guilty of what they believed? What if someone else had manipulated the evidence, twisted his confession, and turned him into a scapegoat? The thought clawed at Smitty's conscience, refusing to let him rest. And the more he thought about it, the more he began to suspect that the real danger wasn't Martin's past, but the people still standing around him. Outside, the media began to circle Fairmont Crest like vultures sensing death. Cameras flashed at the gates, and headlines screamed accusations and speculation. Dupree arrested in connection with old investigation. Secret affair or setup? Truth or betrayal at Fairmont Crest? Anita's phone never stopped ringing, and every unanswered call felt like another fracture forming in the armor she'd spent decades building. The Dupree family's private sins were becoming public currency. Yet even in the midst of crisis, she remained composed. For Anita, this was not the end, it was simply another battle to be won. In his cell, Martin sat in silence. The walls were cold, the air stale, but his thoughts were louder than ever. He replayed every moment of the proposal, every glance exchanged, every word left unsaid. Somewhere between love and punishment, he had lost himself. But as the hours passed, something inside him hardened. Maybe this was his punishment, or maybe it was an opportunity, one final chance to expose the truth that everyone else was too afraid to face. Because he knew, deep down, that the case that destroyed him wasn't over. Someone had set him up to take the fall again. And this time, he would not go quietly. By the end of the week, the Dupree mansion no longer felt like a home. It felt like a battlefield disguised in silk and marble. Every glance between family members carried suspicion. Every conversation was laced with hidden meanings. The proposal that had once symbolized a second chance now stood as the moment everything began to unravel. And as the night fell over Fairmont Crest, one question lingered in the air like smoke: who among them still believed in redemption, and who was already planning their next betrayal? The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that comes before a storm. Somewhere out there, Martin waited, angry, wounded, and ready to fight. And back at the estate, those who had once loved him began to turn on each other, each desperate to survive what was coming next. In Fairmont Crest, truth had become poison, and everyone had already taken their dose.